Welcome to Cosplayland. I am Alice and today we are starting a very new and exciting project. I am doing Yor Forger. She is a super spy but you can't tell anyone, okay? To be more exact, she is actually an assassin and she's the kind of person that just gets very excited whenever they see knives and pointy things like me and my sisters, I guess. So when I started watching Spy Family, which is a new anime that just came out, I got really excited and jumped in the idea of making her dress because it's awesome. For this project, I'm mainly going to be using satin fabrics, a little bit of gold spandex here and there, and little bits and pieces that I found around the house. I'm trying to save as much money as I can because this was not in the plans for this month, and I just want to finish it pretty quickly, so let's see how much we can do with this. Also, remember all the patterns I will be using will be available in my Patreon, and you can also download them from my shop at a later date. Let's get started. The first step was preparing my fabric. I couldn't find any fabric that I liked that had roses or some kind of motif on it that I could use for the lining, so I decided to make my own. Of course, I always make things more difficult for myself whenever I'm doing cosplay because why not? Once I made sure there were no creases on my fabric that will interfere with my paint, I cut the pattern for my skirt and then I prepared it all to start painting my fabric. Remember that my patterns don't have seam allowances, and this is because it's easier to modify anything on the dress if you want to. You can even put together the pieces and create something new with it, and I just found it easier to work with it in general, so I'm just adding seam allowances before I cut the pieces. I'm going to be using just acrylic paints to do the painting on my lining, but if you can also use fabric paint, or you can use some kind of fabric medium to make sure your paint doesn't crack. As it is, just the acrylic paint will work, but just remember this only works because there's no tension on my garment. If I was doing anything with curves or stretchy, I highly recommend you to use that fabric paint or at least the medium. Also, make sure to test your paint before you use it because you can get some surprises. For example, the first one I tried was actually too dark and it didn't go through because I'm actually stamping something a lighter color. It has to be very pigmented. My first choice was Citadel colors, but I ran out and had to go to Galleria, which is thicker. I'm going to be using a stencil for this project, and to make sure it doesn't move, I'm using stick and spray, which is this spray that makes the surface of anything it touches a bit tacky, so it will stay attached to the fabric but not permanently. You don't really need it, but it does help. To make sure my painting is even, I'm actually using a sponge to apply the paint. I am also doing 2 layers of paint because that will help my paint be more striking and more saturated, and it will cover better the dark color underneath. Once I'm happy with the coverage, I can just lift my stencil and move it to the next place. You can download this stencil on my page as well. I must say, I felt like a real murderer while doing this cosplay. Just look at my hands. If you want to avoid it, I would suggest using some gloves when you are using the paint and the sponge. Once I had finished painting my fabric, it was time to assemble the pieces. I started by assembling the bodice. The front is cut on the fold and you need to attach both sides to it to make the front part. Use the notches on the fabric to align the bust correctly. Once they are pinned, you can just use your machine to just stitch them together. Do exactly the same for the back pieces. Finally, you can put the front and the back together. Remember that you want to iron your pieces as you go to have a very crisp finish. And once you're done with the bodice, you have to repeat it all over again for the lining. For the skirt, I'm first closing the darts at the back. And then I can do the front seams. And we can now assemble the sides. At this point, I decided to attach the top of the lining to the dress because otherwise it would be more difficult later on when I add all the straps to it. I simply put the dress and the top of the lining together facing each other and just sew the top part. I also understitched the top of my dress to make sure that lining wasn't going to be poking through unseen at the front. So in order to do this, you just put all the seams to the part that is your lining and you just do a straight stitch only on the lining of your fabric. I didn't have any wide enough black ribbon in my stash, so I decided to use the fabric to make my own kind of bias tape, ribbons, neither of them, just some straps that will do for the time being. This was perhaps my worst mistake because my fabric was slightly stretchy and they definitely didn't want to behave later on. I had to resort to making a tube and turn it to make these lines, and it was totally hell because there were many meters, they didn't want to turn, and they just didn't want to stay flat once I ironed it. So yeah, something that was supposed to be very easy took me forever to complete. Starting with the front and the back ribbons, I pinned them to my dress, trying not to catch the lightning, and I tried to sew it. I had to repeat it 3 times because my fabric didn't want to behave, it was slightly stretchy and I wasn't happy with the outcome, so I just tried until I decided it was enough and it was going to be decent, but I hated it. Once I finished with the ribbons, which I made much longer than I needed to make sure I can adjust later, I started to insert my invisible zipper. It is best to use this invisible zipper foot that does come with many machines, but if it doesn't, it's a great investment. It's only a few pounds and it's very useful. There is a little slot on your zipper foot and you just have to insert your zipper on it and just carry on with your straight stitch. Also, a little trick, if your zipper is a bit longer than you need, then you don't need to close the zipper to end the stitch because you can just shorten at the bottom that zipper and you will be able to stitch till the very end. When you do the other side, make sure you align it correctly so you have a perfect waist as well as the top. And once you're happy with the zipper, you can just carry on and do a straight stitch on the back seam as well. Time to finish the lining. Just do all you did with the skirt, but with your lining. With your lining inside out, you can now place the dress inside the lining and we are going to be attaching it to the very edge at the bottom. Before I turn the fabric, I'm just going to clip the edges to make sure it's easy to turn. And now I'm going to iron the fabric, but just be careful and use some fabric on top so you don't accidentally end up burning your paint and just doing a mess on your iron. I decided to finish my lining by hand. I find it much easier to control it and you won't have any lines visible from the right side. So I'm just going to fold the lining so it hides my zipper, and then I'm just going to hand stitch it in place. For the top part, I only needed a few stitches on some key areas, basically where the seams meet, and the actual sewing is going to be on the skirt. Just make sure it is completely even and flat, because it's very easy for your fabric to shift when you are putting it together. So before you do it, make sure your fabric looks correct. And finally, it's time to make the collar, but first I'm going to interface one of the pieces of the collar so the fabric becomes a little bit stiffer and easier to handle. I will be doing the same for the bottom pieces, but if you want to avoid all these, remember you could use something like fake leather to make this part in one go without having to worry about the lining. Get your pieces ready to sew and just sew both sides, leaving the sides open. Remember to trim your edges a bit shorter so it helps when you turn your fabric. If you are lucky enough to have a mannequin, it is time to use it because it is much easier to assemble this piece on top of it. If not, try to adjust it while you are wearing it. And now we are getting to the exciting part, the props. I 3D printed these pieces because I happen to have a 3D printer, but you don't need to. Actually, most of my needles were done with needles, just knitting needles. And then I added these pieces to the top and the bottom to make it more like in the anime, but you could have done this with curtain rings as well and some twill around your needles. Remember that you can use anything laying around your house to make something similar, or even use craft foam to sculpt them yourself. The top of my needles actually came off very quickly with some pliers. And then I only needed super glue to just put the pieces together. The bottom of my needles didn't fit so well because it was a different piece, so I decided to use some milliput to fill the gap between them. Milliput is an epoxy clay that has two components that when you mix them together become really hard, so it's great for filling gaps if your 3D print didn't come as you wanted, or if there is any pieces that don't match perfectly. Then it was time to paint, but first don't forget to add a layer of primer to make sure your paint sticks correctly. My minions too just use some car paint to paint it all gold while I carry on with the rest of the pieces. I decided to make my headband slightly wider, but I definitely overdid it because I was not looking at the reference. I glued a piece of foam to my headband, and then I used my double-sided tape trick to add some gold spandex around it. I hit the ugly edges with a ribbon on the inside, and then I just had to glue the flowers and the details that look like thorns. These are just wooden skewers that I just cut to size and painted gold. I just had to attach some earring hooks to my earrings and the cosplay was virtually done. And this is how it looks. I haven't completely finished the dress yet, but it was enough to show you how I had made it, so I decided to post this video anyway. Next time I will be showing you the whole piece finished. still need to do something with the wig and probably just find myself some boots and those details that make the character look more interesting, and hopefully I hope you like this tutorial and maybe you can make your own. Remember that the link for this pattern will be in the description, and there is also other things that you can download if you go to my Patreon, like sketches and some planning and some cool drawings that may help you build your own dress. Remember to follow me on social media if you want to be up to date with my latest projects, including my Peppa project, which is still going, just very slowly because I still have to do a lot of embroidery on her. Let me know in the comments if you like this kind of short project and what else would you like me to do. May your day be full of wonders and see you next time. Bye! Don't hit the camera. Are you gonna sew it for me? Yeah?